Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to retake control of Gaza's border with Egypt, further asserting on how Israel's mission to neutralize Hamas is expected to last for months. Meanwhile, the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza is only worsening. According to latest data, 100,000 people have moved into Rafah, and these people lack basic accommodation, food, water and medicine, and they are at a risk of a famine. To talk on the current situation in Gaza, we're now being joined by Dr. Malcolm L. Davis. He's a senior analyst in defense strategy and capability, and he's joining us live from Australia. Thanks very much for joining us on WION, Dr. Davis.
It's my pleasure.
Now, Dr. Davis, 100,000 people have moved into Rafah, the city located as far as south in the Gaza Strip. Now, since the beginning of the war, Israel has asked Gazans to move towards the south of the Strip. But the southern Strip does not appear to be any safer while compared to the rest of the territory.
Well, that's certainly the case. I think that the challenge for the Palestinian people is how to survive between the crossfire between Hamas on the one hand, that is using the Palestinian people as human shields, and the Israeli Defense Forces, which are trying to destroy Hamas. They're not trying to kill Palestinians, they're trying to destroy Hamas. But unfortunately, Palestinian people are caught in the crossfire. So this is a real challenge, because if the Israelis can't defeat Hamas without inflicting large numbers of civilian casualties, then they might win tactically, but they lose strategically because they generate so much international opposition that they can't sustain any peace that they might win.
Right, Dr. Davis, talking about the international pressure on Israel, South Africa has now filed a genocide case against Israel. Well, at least 22,000 people have been killed in Gaza so far. And while the case filed by South Africa, its decisions are binding, it has very little or absolutely no means to enforce them.
Well, as essentially the Israelis are caught between a rock and a hard place here, because if they stop the war now, as many countries are calling for them to do, then Hamas is left intact. They can regroup, rearm, and then they can attack Israel again in the same way that they did on October the 7th. So Israel have to win this war militarily, but they have to do so in a way that doesn't generate needless civilian casualties and leave themselves open to claims of genocide like the South Africans have made.
But how possibly can Israel actually achieve that? Because Netanyahu has been very adamant. Netanyahu has emphasized on how the ultimate aim of the ongoing war is to eliminate and destruct Hamas completely. But we've also been seeing that the casualties, the civilian casualties, that has been increasing.
Yes, and it's as I said, this is a challenge. In part because the way the Israelis are carrying out this fight, I do think they need to transition away from using large airstrikes and artillery strikes that by nature are indiscriminate to something much more precise and focused, with a heavy emphasis on forward ground forces. So militarily, they need to I think, shift their strategy and their tactics to reduce the number of civilian casualties. And there might be instances, for example, where they simply can't strike because there are too many civilians at risk. On the other hand, you do have to acknowledge that Hamas are using Palestinians as human shields. So Hamas are deliberately exposing Palestinians to danger. And I think it's wrong to suggest that this is purely on the Israelis. Hamas also should share the blame as well.
Right, and there are also growing concerns that a second front could open the nearly 3 months old war between Israel and Gaza, especially after 19 pro-Iranian fighters were killed in the strikes allegedly launched by Israel.
Well, I think that you've got to a key point here, in the sense that Iran has manipulated and coordinated a lot of these operations, including October the 7th, including the attacks by Houthis against international shipping, and including attacks by radical Islamist and Palestinian groups across Iraq and Syria against US forces. So there is a real risk of escalation to a wider war, driven primarily by Iran's action against Israel and the United States.
My last question to you, Dr. Davis. There are latest reports which indicate that the Israeli government is not financially ready for a prolonged war in Gaza, as per Reuters report that is. But Netanyahu, in the latest we've seen, he's emphasized that the war will continue for a few more months. How exactly does Israel plan to do so?
I think it has to appeal for aid from the US and potentially other countries to sustain the operations. And once again, that comes back to my earlier point. If they want to sustain operations and if they want to maintain any semblance of international support, they have to transition to a different approach to using military force that doesn't inflict so many casualties. There's international legal precepts called jus in bello, which basically emphasizes discrimination, proportionality, and necessity. Israel has to start following that. If they can start following those international laws of war and reduce the number of casualties, then I think aid will be forthcoming to Israel. And I think it's also critical to point out that from Iran's perspective, from the position of Tehran, they might have it in their interest to expand the war, to basically force Israel into a larger war, because if Israel is facing a financial crunch, then it's in Iran's interest to try and force that larger war, not only on Israel, but also against the United States. So this is not a simple situation of it's just Israel versus Gaza. There's an important Iranian dimension to this too.
Right. And Dr. Davis, how do you assess the United States of America's role in the ongoing Israel-Hamas war?
Look, I think the Americans are trying to provide Israel with support where they can. Obviously, intelligence support would be really important, but also provision of munitions and weapons capabilities. But the US is also trying to support the Ukrainians, and they're also trying to maintain their own military capabilities to deter the likes of China and Russia directly. So I think that the Americans are basically confronted by multiple threats on all directions. In the Middle East, they do have to deter Iran effectively. At the moment, they haven't been doing that because the responses of the US to Iranian attacks on US forces has been rather limited. They're now gathering forces in the Red Sea as part of Operation Prosperity Guardian. And the question is, will they actually launch strikes against the Houthis to stop those attacks from occurring? If they just do a defensive posture there, that's not going to deter Iran. And Iran will then feel incentivized to actually expand the war in the region. So I think that the American position is really critical. They have to support Israel, but Israel has to transition to a more focused, precise way of war for that support to continue.
Right, Dr. Davis, thanks very much for joining us and WION, sharing insights with us. Always a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much.